And therefore, I think we have two tasks before us. First, our task is one of discernment and not of judgment. As inconvenient as it is for our ego, I believe that everyone is acting in what they believe to be a faithful response to our times. And our calling, therefore, is not to label some as orthodox and some as heretical, nor to label some as interested in unity and others as interested in justice, and especially not to label some as interested in power and some as interested in reconciliation. Our calling is to discern what activities will aid in the building up of the body of Christ, so that all might grow into the fullness of Christ, and to put all of our energy, all of our activities, all of our prayers in those things. In short, let's focus on what gives life and let the rest go. For example, the three bishops from San Joaquin, Pittsburgh, and Quincy who have left the Episcopal Church are simply not our business. And focusing on them will not bring life to the Diocese of Western North Carolina, or for that matter, to the Episcopal Church. Our task is to invest ourselves in what enhances, what enlarges the abundant life of Jesus Christ, and leave the rest to Christ to build up the body. Second, our task in these confusing times is to be agents of God's radical good news. Because the world says to us, there are 5,000 or maybe 5 billion people, and all you've got is 5 loaves and 2 fish. And those 5 loaves and 2 fish aren't worth as much today as they were a month ago. And what we have to say as disciples of Jesus Christ is there's still enough for everyone. For everyone. If we hold on to Christ for dear life, we remember that Christ's abundant love extends to all people. And therefore, Christ asks for us to open our wallets and open our hearts and opens our churches. And I believe this is a wonderful moment for the Episcopal Church to stand up and to stand out. And I think it's a wonderful moment for us to live out the good news which doesn't make sense to the world. And so we are to say, blessed are those who focus on the poor around the world even when their investments shrink. Blessed are those who remind our nation that we are still infected with racism even when we just elected the first African American president. Blessed are those who dare to break bread with all people, even when the country says we're separated into red and blue states. As Bishop Catherine said, the newspaper prints stories of division and acrimony in the Episcopal Church, but those stories are not our church. Our Episcopal Church is holding on to Christ for dear life. And our Episcopal Church is inviting all people to come to the center, which is the only place that they can meet one another and experience the presence of Christ. That center is the only home we have in the storm. And it's the only home we have this side of the grave. I am proud to be an Episcopalian. And I hope you are, and I hope we proclaim that in what we do as well as what we say. Finally, that's always a good thing to hear in one of these addresses. Finally, the Anglican Communion. It's a mystery. Every time I think about how to unify the Anglican communion, I find myself picking up a mystery novel so I don't get a headache. The good news is, with this issue, it's easy to hold on to Christ for dear life because it's the only option we have left. We are in that tension that Walter Wink talks about, where it seems as if the only two doors are fight and flight. And we, at the moment, cannot see our way to the third way of engagement that Jesus calls us to. I have to tell you, I do not know how this is going to work out. I have no problem in believing it will work out. I want to tell you the big surprise for me. Going to the Lambeth conference has convinced me, and I want to say I really was not convinced of this, has convinced me of how essential the Anglican communion is. I was able to see what that nebulous Anglican virtue of comprehensiveness looked like, and what an important witness that is to the wideness of Christ's mercy. It is important that we are connected to something larger than the Episcopal Church for ourselves, but also for the other 37 provinces. We have gifts to give one another, and we cannot receive them without each other. It is hard for us to admit that we might need a nudge from Nigeria or Rwanda to correct our tendency that Americans are on the cutting edge of everything. But it's true. We do. And they need us to push against their limits as well. This is the best line in the address, so get ready. The Episcopal Church is the gift the Anglican communion hasn't figured out how to receive. I learned a great deal about what it means to be a Christian as well as an Anglican from bishops from Kenya and India and South Africa and New Zealand and Swaziland and the other 125 countries represented. And without a communion with them, our notion of church would become too small and too narrow, and so would theirs. The dilemma is that across the communion, everyone is saying the same thing, which is this: you need to be just like us so we can get along. And that, of course, cannot lead to the real communion, which is Pentecost. That will only lead to a federation, which is a kind of Anglican club with a select membership. So all I can say is this. First, we need to be who we are as the Episcopal Church. And yet, we need to find a way to increase our connectedness with our sister churches in ways that aren't just about what Bishop Catherine and her staff do or what bishops do, but are about what the baptized do. This is why it is so important to have formal and informal companions and connections to the wider church. Because I cannot tell you how many Anglican bishops had a totally false picture of the Episcopal Church until I was able to talk to them face to face and say to them, that is not our church.